It was the middle of the largest war in human history. Men were flying in machines of aluminum and steel, thousands of feet in the air, often in total darkness. They were trained to identify every known aircraft, friendly or enemy, in a split second. Their lives depended on it, but they started seeing things that were not in their recognition manuals. Strange lights, glowing orbs, objects that moved with impossible speed and agility. Or they would appear out of nowhere, pace their planes for miles, and then vanish in an instant. The pilots were seasoned veterans, not prone to fantasy, so, what were they seeing, and why did both sides of the conflict report the exact same phenomena? These were not just isolated incidents. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of sightings. They had a name for them. A name born from a silly comic strip. A name that tried to put a label on the utterly unknowable. They called them Foo Fighters. Number 5. What was left behind after the lights went out? The war ended in 1945. The pilots came home. But the stories they brought back did not just fade away. The Foo Fighter phenomenon didn't die with the ceasefire. It became a kind of prequel to the modern UFO era. The official reports filed in the heat of combat were now sitting in dusty files waiting to be examined. And the government did examine them. They had to. Too many credible witnesses, too many high-ranking officers had seen these things. The military couldn't just ignore it. In 1947, 2 years after the war, the mystery exploded into public consciousness again. An amateur pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 shiny crescent-shaped objects flying at incredible speeds near Mount Rainier in Washington. The media called them flying saucers, and the name stuck. Suddenly, the wartime sightings of Foo Fighters seemed less like isolated oddities and more like the beginning of something much bigger. The questions asked by pilots over Germany and the Pacific were now being asked by people all over the world. This public wave of sightings pushed the United States Air Force to act. They established Project Sign at the end of 1947. This was the first official peacetime study to investigate these flying objects. Its purpose was to collect, collate, and evaluate all the data on these sightings. The team was based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a place that would become central to UFO research for decades. The people working on Project Sign had access to the wartime Foo Fighter reports. They saw the patterns. They read the testimony of decorated pilots. The team at Project Sign was split. Some believed the objects were misidentifications of known phenomena, or perhaps advanced Soviet aircraft. But a significant faction, including the project's head, Captain Robert Snyder, leaned towards a much more extraordinary conclusion. They compiled a top-secret document called the Estimate of the Situation. This report allegedly concluded that the flying discs were real and most likely extraterrestrial in origin. It was a stunning conclusion for a military group to reach. The report was sent up the chain of command to the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt Vandenberg. According to insiders like Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, who later headed another UFO study, Vandenberg rejected the conclusion. He reportedly sent it back saying there was not enough evidence. The estimate of the situation was ordered destroyed. The official study had hit a wall. Because of this internal disagreement, Project Sign was disbanded and replaced in 1949 by Project Grudge. The tone of this new project was different. It was openly skeptical. The unwritten mandate seemed to be to debunk sightings, not to investigate them with an open mind. Your Project Grudge issued a final report in 1949 that concluded most sightings were misinterpretations of conventional objects. The rest were attributed to psychological factors or hoaxes. The report suggested that the subject should be stripped of its special status. The message was clear: there's nothing to see here. The Foo Fighters and the new flying saucers were just a collection of mistakes. But the sightings didn't stop. They continued, and in the early 1950s, they intensified. In 1952, a series of radar and visual contacts over Washington, D.C. caused a national panic. Fighter jets were scrambled to intercept unknown targets over the nation's capital. This event made the conclusions of Project Grudge look weak and premature. The Central Intelligence Agency got involved. They were worried about the potential for mass hysteria, or the possibility that an enemy could use the UFO phenomenon to clog intelligence channels during a real attack. This led to the creation of a secret scientific panel in 1953, convened by the CIA. It was headed by Dr. H.P. Robertson, a physicist from the California Institute of Technology. The group, which became known as the Robertson Panel, included several prominent scientists. They met for just a few days to review the best evidence collected by the Air Force, including films and radar data. Their conclusion echoed Project Grudge. They found no evidence that UFOs were a threat to national security, and no evidence of their extraterrestrial origin. They recommended a public relations campaign to debunk the subject and strip it of its aura of mystery. Organizations like the Civilian Saucer Investigation were seen as potentially subversive, and the panel suggested they be monitored. The focus had shifted from genuine investigation to public perception management. The Robertson panel's findings set the official tone for decades. The new Air Force study, Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 to 1969, often operated under this debunking mandate. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer who was the scientific consultant for Blue Book, initially agreed with the skeptical approach. But over the years, after personally investigating hundreds of cases, he changed his mind. He saw that a small but significant percentage of sightings simply could not be explained. He later wrote about his frustration with the project's unscientific methods and its commitment to explaining away every case, no matter how compelling. The Foo Fighter reports were the foundation of all of this. They were the first large-scale wave of sightings reported by unimpeachable witnesses. The pilots of the Second World War were not looking for flying saucers. The term didn't even exist. They were professional observers whose reports the military had to take seriously. The official investigations that followed, from Sign to Grudge to Blue Book, all had to contend with that initial, undeniable mystery. They could dismiss a civilian report as a mistake or a hoax, but how do you dismiss hundreds of similar reports from your own best pilots? The legacy of the Foo Fighters is a strange one. On one hand, the phenomenon was buried under layers of official denial and skeptical reports. On the other hand, the stories never went away. They were kept alive by researchers and the pilots themselves who knew what they had seen. The official explanation was that they were tricks of the light or tricks of the mind. But for the men who flew through the dark skies of Europe and the Pacific, the lights were very real. They were a mystery that appeared in the middle of a war and never really left. The questions they raised in 1944 are the same questions we are asking today. So if the government's own first study group, Project Sign, concluded these objects were real and from somewhere else, why was that conclusion buried so aggressively? What did General Vandenberg know or fear that made him reject the estimate of the situation? If the goal of the Robertson panel was simply to debunk the topic for public consumption, what was the real classified opinion of the intelligence agencies? On History of UFO Secrecy have started not in 1947 with flying saucers, but in 1944 with a few glowing balls of light that scared the best pilots in the world. Number 4, were these just tricks of the mind? When you have hundreds of reports of something strange, the first logical step is to look for a simple, conventional explanation. The military intelligence officers who first heard the Foo Fighter stories did exactly that. They were practical men dealing with the realities of war. They weren't looking for mysterious phenomena, they were looking for answers that made sense, and several theories were proposed both at the time and in the decades since. The most common ones were St. Elmo's fire, ball lightning, and reflections off the aircraft's own canopy. Others suggested psychological factors like combat fatigue and hypoxia. Let's look at St. Elmo's fire first. This is a real weather phenomenon. It's a discharge of plasma, a bright glow that can appear on pointed objects like the mast of a ship or the wingtip of an airplane during a thunderstorm. It's caused by a powerful electrical field in the atmosphere. Some of the Foo Fighter reports do sound a bit like this. Pilots described lights that seemed to cling to their wingtips or dance around their propellers. A report from the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron in December 1944 described two lights which flew on our wingtips for a considerable period of time. This could, in theory, be St. Elmo's fire. But there was a big problem with this explanation. St. Elmo's fire is a static phenomenon. It sticks to the aircraft. It doesn't fly in formation off the wing. It doesn't peel off and disappear into the distance. It certainly doesn't show up on radar. Many pilots were adamant that the lights they saw were under intelligent control. A pilot from the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, Lieutenant Donald Myers, who is often credited with coining the name Foo Fighter, described an object that flew in a beautiful, graceful arc and disappeared. That is not the behavior of an atmospheric electrical discharge. Furthermore, St. Elmo's fire typically occurs in specific weather conditions, like thunderstorms. Many Foo Fighter sightings happened in crystal clear skies. The pilots knew what St. Elmo's fire was. They had seen it before, and they were quick to say, this was not that. Another candidate was ball lightning. This is a much rarer and more mysterious phenomenon than St. Elmo's fire. It's described as a luminous sphere, typically the size of a grapefruit or a basketball, that can appear during thunderstorms. It can hover, move erratically, and then vanish, sometimes with a small explosion. Scientists still don't fully understand what causes it. On the surface, this sounds a lot like a Foo Fighter, a glowing ball of light that moves in strange ways. But again, the details don't quite line up. Ball lightning is extremely rare and short-lived, usually lasting only a few seconds. Foo Fighters were often seen for many minutes, sometimes for half an hour or more. They would pace aircraft for 50 or 60 miles. Ball lightning is also associated with thunderstorms. As with St. Elmo's fire, many Foo Fighter sightings occurred in clear weather. And most importantly, ball lightning is a natural, random event. It does not display the kind of apparently intelligent behavior reported by pilots. They described the lights as playing a cat and mouse game, approaching their aircraft, then backing off, then appearing on the other side. They seem to react to the pilot's movements. One B-17 crew reported that when their gunners aimed at the light, it would immediately move away. This suggests some kind of awareness, not a random ball of plasma. What about simple reflections? Could pilots be seeing city lights or searchlights reflecting off the plexiglass of their own cockpit canopies? This is certainly possible in some cases. A pilot, tired and on edge, could mistake an internal reflection for an external object. But this explanation falls apart when multiple crew members see the same object from different positions in the aircraft. In a B-29 bomber, for example, you had a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and gunners, all with different vantage points. When they all reported seeing the same object in the same location, it could not be a simple reflection. And this explanation completely fails when the object is tracked on radar. Radar doesn't see reflections off a canopy. It sees a solid object out there in the sky, and Fred Ringwald, the radar operator with the 415th, confirmed they got radar returns from these objects. This brings us to the psychological explanations. The men flying these missions were under immense stress. They were flying long hours, often at night, in hostile territory with the constant threat of being shot down. Fatigue, fear, and a lack of oxygen at high altitudes, hypoxia, can all cause visual and cognitive distortions. Could the Foo Fighters have been hallucinations brought on by the extreme conditions of aerial warfare? It's a plausible idea, but it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. These sightings were not reported by a single stressed-out pilot. They were reported by entire crews, squadron after squadron, across different theaters of war. British, American, German, and Japanese pilots all reported seeing them. It seems highly unlikely that pilots from different cultures flying different aircraft in different parts of the world would all start having the exact same hallucination. The reports were also remarkably consistent in their descriptions of the object's appearance and behavior. Hallucinations are typically a personal and chaotic experience, not a shared, structured one. Moreover, the pilots themselves were the first to question their own senses. These were not excitable people. They were trained professionals. Their first reaction was not to believe what they were seeing. They checked with their crewmates. Do you see what I see? Was a common question over the intercom. They checked their instruments. They checked their oxygen supply. They did everything they could to find a rational explanation before filing a report. In an article in the American Legion magazine in 1945, journalist Joe Chamberlain interviewed several pilots about their sightings. They were clear that they had considered all the conventional explanations and rejected them. They knew what they saw was a real physical object flying under its own power. The German and Japanese forces had their own encounters, which adds another layer to the mystery. German pilots reported strange lights and objects, which they sometimes called Krautfeuerkugel or Kraut fireballs. They assumed it was a new Allied secret weapon or surveillance device. The Allies, of course, thought the Foo Fighters were a German secret weapon. The fact that both sides were seeing the same things and attributing them to the enemy suggests that the objects were not from either side. They were something else, an unknown third party in the conflict. The push to explain away the Foo Fighters as mundane phenomena never really satisfied the people who had seen them. They were left with a profound sense of mystery. They had witnessed something that did not fit into their understanding of the world. It was easy for a scientist on the ground decades later to talk about plasma or fatigue. It was another thing entirely to be 20,000 feet over a blacked out landscape with a glowing red ball flying formation on your wing. So, if it wasn't St. Elmo's fire and it wasn't ball lightning, what was it? If entire well-rested crews saw the same thing, how could it be a hallucination? And why did radar, an unblinking electronic eye, confirm the presence of a solid object? Was there a physical phenomenon unknown to science then and now that could perfectly mimic an intelligently controlled craft? Or were the pilots right all along? Number 3, were they all seeing the same thing? One of the most puzzling aspects of the Foo Fighter phenomenon is the variety of the reports. If it were a single type of secret weapon or natural phenomenon, you would expect the descriptions to be fairly uniform. But they were not. Pilots reported a wide range of shapes, colors, and behaviors. This diversity makes the puzzle harder to solve. It suggests that either there were multiple different types of objects, or the object could change its appearance. Let's start with the most common description, a glowing ball of light. This was the classic Foo Fighter. But even within this category, there were variations. The colors reported were most often red, orange, or white. Sometimes a single object would be seen. Other times, pilots reported groups of them. A report from the 415th Night Fighter Squadron on December 22nd, 1944, over Hagen, Germany, is a classic example. The pilot, L.T. Wallace, Wally and Fust, and his radar observer, Let Robert Bob M. Poole, saw a single, large, brilliant red light. It appeared suddenly at their altitude, about 10,000 feet. They pursued it, but it seemed to anticipate their moves and kept its distance before eventually flying away and disappearing. Just a few days later, another crew from the same squadron encountered something different. On December 27th, a pilot reported being followed by a group of about 10 to 15 reddish-orange lights. They appeared in a ITT formation and seemed to follow his aircraft for several minutes. This was not a single curious light. This was a fleet of them, moving in a coordinated pattern. This is much harder to explain as a natural phenomenon like ball lightning. The behavior of these lights was just as varied as their appearance. Sometimes they were passive observers. A pilot flying a mosquito intruder mission for the Royal Air Force described a bright, steady light that followed him all the way from the Dutch coast to the Ruhr industrial area of Germany. It stayed about 500 yards off his port wing, never getting closer, never falling behind. It was just there, a silent companion in the dark. It caused no interference with his instruments and showed no hostile intent. After about 45 minutes, it simply vanished. Other times, the objects were incredibly agile and seemed to be playful or even evasive. Pilots described them making instant right-angle turns and accelerating to speeds that no known aircraft could match. A P-47 Thunderbolt pilot over Germany reported seeing a golden ball that flew circles around his formation. When he tried to turn and get a better look, it shot straight up and disappeared in a matter of seconds. This kind of performance was what really baffled the pilots. Their own planes were the pinnacle of aviation technology at the time, but they were sluggish and clumsy compared to these things. While the glowing orbs were the most common sighting in Europe, the phenomenon was not limited to that theater of war. And it was not limited to balls of light. Over in the Pacific, crews of the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers reported their own strange encounters. And their descriptions were often different. In August 1944, a B-29 on a mission over the Dutch East Indies was approached by a large glowing object described as looking like a fiery red ball. But other reports from the Pacific described more structured craft. One famous incident occurred in late 1944 near the Japanese island of Truk. The crew of a B-29, commanded by Captain D.W. Pappy Parshall, reported seeing several objects. The gunners called them out over the intercom. They were described as dark, symmetrical shapes, almost like large spheres, but they were also trailing a strange phosphorescent plume. They paced the bomber, moving with incredible speed. The gunners were given permission to fire on them, but the objects were too fast and agile. They easily evaded the machine gun fire and eventually flew away. Another B-29 crew on a night mission over Japan reported being illuminated by a strange searchlight from an unknown source above them. There were no other aircraft in the area at that altitude. At the same time, their radar picked up a target. This suggests a solid object was there, not just a light. The crew of another B-29 flying near Nagasaki reported an object that looked like two searchlights held together by a bar. It flew alongside them for a while before disappearing. The shapes were not always spheres or lights. Some reports mention disc-shaped or saucer-shaped objects years before that term became popular. A pilot with the 8th Air Force in England reported seeing a gleaming metallic disc that shot past his formation at high speed during a daylight mission. Others described cigar-shaped objects. A B-17 crew flying over Germany reported a long, thin, wingless object that kept pace with them for several minutes before accelerating away. This sheer variety is what makes the Foo Fighter mystery so compelling and frustrating. If every report described a 10-foot orange ball, you could focus on finding a single cause. But we have single red balls, groups of orange lights, metallic discs, dark spheres, and cigar shapes. We have passive followers and agile acrobats. We have sightings at night and in broad daylight. The sightings occurred over Germany, France, Italy, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. They were seen by American, British, German, and Japanese pilots. The official explanation at the time was that these were new enemy secret weapons. The Americans thought it was a German device to jam their radar or dazzle their pilots. The Germans thought it was an Allied device to do the same to them. After the war, when intelligence officers from both sides compared notes, they realized a startling truth. Neither side had anything like the Foo Fighters. The technology described by the pilots did not exist on Earth at that time. This leaves us with a difficult set of possibilities. Were there multiple unrelated phenomena all happening at the same time? Could some sightings be St. Elmo's fire, others be secret test aircraft, and still others be something else entirely? Or was there a single unknown phenomenon that could present itself in many different forms? The lack of consistency in the reports is one of the strongest arguments against a simple explanation. It points towards something complex, something that did not follow any known rules of physics or technology. Why were the objects seen over Europe mostly described as simple lights, while those in the Pacific were sometimes described as more structured physical craft? Did the different environments or types of missions influence what was seen or how it was perceived? Or were different kinds of objects operating in different parts of the world? And if they weren't ours and they weren't the enemies, then whose were they? Number 2, how did the reports spread from cockpit to command? The story of the Foo Fighters isn't just about strange lights in the sky. It's also a story about information. It's about how a bizarre, unbelievable experience in a lonely cockpit gets turned into an official intelligence report, and how that report travels up the chain of command. It's about the moment a personal mystery becomes a military problem. This process began in earnest in the autumn of 1944 with a single unit, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. The 415th was an elite unit flying specially equipped Beaufighter and later Mosquito aircraft. Their job was to hunt enemy planes at night. They were experts in using airborne radar to find and intercept targets in total darkness. Their pilots and radar observers were some of the most skilled and technologically savvy airmen in the war. They were not easily fooled. Their home base was in Dijon, France, and their patrol area was over the Rhine Valley in Germany. This is where the story truly starts. In late November 1944, crews from the 415th started reporting strange visual and radar contacts. The initial reports were often met with skepticism. The intelligence officer for the squadron, Lieutenant Joseph Joe Markowitz, was the first official person to hear these stories. The pilots would come back from a mission, looking shaken, and describe being followed by lights. At first, he might have dismissed it as combat stress. But the reports kept coming, from different crews, all describing the same thing. A key early sighting involves Lieutenant Ed Schluter and his radar observer, Lieutenant Donald J. Myers. They were flying a mission when they saw a series of red lights in the distance. The lights seemed to be moving at high speed, keeping pace with their aircraft. They were not on any known flight path. Myers couldn't get a solid lock on them with his radar. which was strange. The lights followed them for a time and then vanished. When they landed and filed their report, they were at a loss for how to describe what they had seen. This is where the name came from. Donald Myers was a fan of a popular comic strip called Smokey Stover, created by Bill Holman. The comic was filled with puns and silly catchphrases. One of Smokey's favorite phrases, whenever something mysterious was afoot, was, "Where there's foo, there's fire." During a briefing after yet another strange sighting, Myers reportedly walked into the intelligence office and, in a moment of frustration and dark humor, declared, "It was another one of those Foo Fighters." The name was catchy, a little bit silly, and it captured the strange, fiery nature of the objects. It stuck. From that point on, the mysterious lights had a name. The intelligence officer, Markowitz, soon realized he had a serious situation on his hands. These were not one-off reports from rookies. These were consistent, detailed accounts from his best crews. He had a duty to take them seriously. He began to compile a formal record of the sightings. He debriefed the pilots and radar observers, collecting details about the object's speed, color, altitude, and behavior. He noted the radar contacts, which were crucial because they suggested a physical object was present. The reports from the 415th started to move up the military hierarchy. From the squadron level, they went to the 12th Air Force headquarters. The brass there were just as puzzled. Their first assumption was that it must be a new German secret weapon. Perhaps a new type of flare designed to blind night fighter pilots, or a remote-controlled device to jam their radar. This was a logical conclusion in the context of the war. The Germans had already deployed advanced technologies like jet fighters and guided rockets, so another surprise was not out of the question. An order was sent out to all Allied pilots to try to pursue and shoot down one of these objects if possible. But that proved to be impossible. The Foo Fighters were too fast and too agile. No Allied fighter could catch them. The news of these strange sightings couldn't be contained within the military forever. Journalists stationed in Europe began to hear whispers. One of them was Robert C. Wilson, a correspondent for the Associated Press. He heard the stories coming out of the night fighter squadrons and recognized it as a major story. He started asking questions and managed to get confirmation from official sources. On January 1st, 1945, his story ran in newspapers across the United States. The headline in the New York Times read, "Balls of fire stalk U.S. fighters in night forays over Germany." Wilson's article was the first time the public heard about the Foo Fighters. He quoted an intelligence officer who said, "We have had reports of these lights from pilots for more than a month. We don't know what they are." The article described the objects as balls of fire that would follow our planes for miles. It also made it clear that the objects were not hostile. They never fired on the Allied planes. The story caused a sensation. It was a strange, eerie mystery in the middle of a war that was already full of drama. Other publications followed. Time magazine ran a piece on the Foo Fighters in its January 15th, 1945 issue. They confirmed that the phenomena were taken seriously by Allied headquarters and that they had been observed for over a month. They also reported the German side of the story, noting that German radio had also described these balls of fire and claimed they were a new Allied weapon. This public confirmation that both sides were seeing the same thing and blaming each other only deepened the mystery. The official military reaction to the publicity was mixed. On one hand, they wanted to understand the phenomenon. On the other hand, they didn't want to cause a panic or reveal that they were baffled by something happening in their own airspace. The sightings were given the official designation of unidentified aerial phenomena, the ancestor of the term unidentified flying object. But behind the scenes, there was no clear answer. Technical intelligence teams studied the reports. They looked at the possibility of static electricity, reflections, or German technology. None of the explanations fit all the facts. The journey of the Foo Fighter story, from a confused conversation between a pilot and his intelligence officer to an international news headline, was remarkably fast. It shows how compelling and widespread the sightings were. The military couldn't keep it quiet because too many people were seeing these things. The reports were so consistent and came from such credible sources that they had to be recorded and passed up the line. And a good journalist, Robert Wilson, recognized that a mystery that stumped the U.S. Air Force was a story the world needed to hear. Why did the phenomenon seem to concentrate so heavily around the 415th Night Fighter Squadron in late 1944? Was it something about their location, their equipment, or were they just the first to systematically report it? How did the pilots and intelligence officers process this information, which fell so far outside their training and experience? And what was it like for the senior commanders who were responsible for winning a war to be confronted with reports of objects that defied all known technology and seemed to operate with complete impunity in the skies over the battlefield? Number one, where did the name Foo Fighter even come from? Every great mystery needs a name. A name gives it shape. It allows people to talk about something that is otherwise indescribable. The mystery of the strange lights seen by pilots in the Second World War got its name in the cold winter of 1944, and it came from the most unlikely of places, a newspaper comic strip. The name was Foo Fighter, and its origin is a perfect example of the strange mix of high-stakes reality and surreal absurdity that defined the experience of the airmen who saw them. The story begins, as many do, with young men far from home looking for a way to cope with the stress of war. In the briefing rooms and ready rooms of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron in France, one of the popular distractions was the comic strip Smokey Stover. Created by cartoonist Bill Holman, Smokey Stover was a surreal, slapstick comic about a bumbling fireman. It was famous for its nonsensical humor and its love of puns. The main character, Smokey, would often exclaim, "Where there's foo, there's fire." The word foo was just a nonsense word Holman had seen on the bottom of a Chinese porcelain figurine. He thought it was funny, so he put it in his comic. It had no real meaning. It was just a placeholder for the absurd. In November 1944, the crews of the 415th started seeing things that were just as absurd as anything in Smokey Stover. They were flying missions over the Rhine Valley, a heavily defended industrial heartland. Their job was to fly in the dark, using their new secret airborne radar to find and destroy enemy aircraft. It was dangerous, nerve-wracking work. And then the lights appeared. One of the first well-documented sightings that set the stage for the naming of the phenomenon occurred on November 23rd, 1944. A pilot named Lieutenant Ed Schluter was flying a Beaufighter aircraft near Speyer, Germany. His radar operator was Lieutenant Donald J. Myers. They were flying at about 10,000 feet when they saw them. Off in the distance, a group of 8 to 10 glowing orange lights appeared. They were in a line, flying fast. Schluter and Myers had no idea what they were. They weren't flares. They weren't aircraft. They could recognize. They checked with Allied ground control radar, but they had nothing on their screens. The lights paced their plane for a few minutes and then simply faded out. The two men were baffled. The sightings continued. Night after night, different crews would come back with similar stories. Glowing balls, usually red or orange, would appear out of nowhere. They would fly in perfect formation with the Allied planes, sometimes off one wing, sometimes behind the tail. They seemed to move with a strange, fluid grace. When the pilots tried to turn towards them, or take evasive action, the lights would mirror their movements perfectly. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they would vanish. Sometimes they would just blink out, other times they would accelerate and shoot up into the sky at impossible speeds. The pilots were professionals. They tried to find a logical explanation. They thought maybe it was a new kind of German flare intended to mess with their vision. But the lights didn't behave like flares. Flares fall. These things flew. They thought maybe it was some kind of psychological warfare, a projection, or a trick. But the lights were solid enough to be seen by the entire crew, and sometimes, they even got a faint return on the radar. It was in this atmosphere of deepening mystery and frustration that the name was born. Donald J. Mears, the radar operator from the November 23rd sighting, was in the briefing room with his pilot, Ed Schluter, and a few other crew members. They were reading a new issue of Smokey Stover. At the same time, the intelligence officer was asking them to come up with a name for the phenomenon for their official reports. They were tired of writing unexplained lights or mystery objects. Combining the comic strip he had just been reading with the fiery appearance of the objects, Myers came up with Foo Fighters. It was a joke, a way to use a nonsense word for a nonsense situation, but it captured the feeling perfectly. It was a name that acknowledged the absurdity of it all. The name spread like wildfire through the squadron and then to other units. It was easier to say, I saw a Foo Fighter, than to try and describe the whole bizarre experience from scratch. The name gave the pilots a shared language for the unknowable. It was a bit of gallows humor, a way of domesticating a phenomenon that was deeply unsettling. These men were flying in the most advanced machines of their time, but they were being confronted with something that seemed to be from another technological reality altogether. The first official reports using the term Foo Fighter began to circulate in December 1944. An intelligence summary from the 12th Air Force, dated December 20th, 1944, specifically mentioned the Foo Fighter phenomenon and detailed the sightings by the 415th. The report noted that the objects seemed to be under intelligent control and that their purpose was unknown. This was a significant moment. A joke name born from a comic strip had just entered the official military lexicon. The timing of the first sightings is also important. They began in late 1944, a time when the war was reaching its technological peak. Both sides were using jet aircraft, guided missiles, and advanced radar systems. It was a time of rapid technological change, so the idea of a secret weapon was on everyone's mind. The Foo Fighters appeared right at this intersection of high technology and high anxiety. So the origin of the name Foo Fighter tells us something crucial about the phenomenon itself. It wasn't treated with reverence or immediate panic. It was treated with the dark, pragmatic humor of soldiers. They gave it a silly name because the situation was too strange for a serious one. But the name also helped the story to spread, to become a legend. It was simple, memorable, and a little bit spooky. It was the perfect label for a mystery that appeared in the dark skies of a world at war, a mystery that, for all our progress, we still haven't solved. What does it say about the phenomenon that the men who faced it every night chose to name it after a cartoon? Does the casual, almost dismissive name hide a deeper fear of the unknown? And how did a nonsense word, foo, come to be associated with one of the most enduring technological mysteries of the 20th century? Was it just a coincidence? Or was it the perfect word for something that, by its very nature, defied all our existing language?